Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the Necron forces. In this video, we'll be covering the special HQ choices for the Necron armies, as we've already covered the normal HQ choices, and there's quite a few different ones. But before we begin, I'd like to cover one correction. In the previous video, I mentioned that the Triarch Stalker's targeting relay ability adds 1 to the hit roll, when in reality, it just allows you to reroll hit rolls of 1 against the target affected by the targeting relay. A bit of an error on my part, and thank you for everyone who pointed out, as it lets me make these corrections and keeps the content accurate to those who are listening and might not be as familiar with the rules. Now to get into special characters, some of them have been seeing play, and they're not bad in themselves. It's mostly an issue that a lot of them are rather expensive in points, and because of how many HQ choices the Necrons already have, it becomes a little harder to include them into your army as easily as you would like. Though even at their current point costs, we do see some of them show up in army lists, and I believe that if the points were tweaked a little bit, not significantly, but just enough to make them more enticing, we'd see a lot more characters seeing play within tournaments. And as only a couple of them have seen play in tournaments, this list will mostly be my opinion, so the position of any character named here may be drastically different based on how you play them and based on how you structure your army list, as each character provides different pros and cons when being taken within an army. So with that being said, let's get right into the content. The first on the list, and the character I think is probably the best, as well as one that has seen play within tournaments, is Illuminor Szeras at number 1. Illuminor Szeras is a somewhat expensive model at 160 points, and he has the Dynastic Agent ability. However, he does not have the Dynastic Advisor's ability and counts as a Technomancer in himself. For that 160 points, he actually has a rather good stat line at an 8-inch movement speed, a 3+ weapon and ballistic skill, and a toughness and strength of 6, while also sporting 7 wounds and a 3+ armor save. This makes him actually a rather tough target, and he can actually put out quite a bit of damage, considering he's armed with some rather good weapons. The first being an Eldritch Lance, which gives him a 36-inch range when shooting, and assault D3 shots at strength 8, armor penetration of 4, and D6 damage. Now that already in itself is incredibly heavy hitting, sort of like the Entropic Lance that we see on the Chronomancers, though with a much longer range and double the shots on average at 2 shots. For melee, he's no slouch either, as he has the Eldritch Lance, which also acts as a melee weapon, at his strength of 6, with 4 armor penetration and a damage characteristic of 2. That makes it a rather powerful melee weapon, and he even gets a couple of extra attacks thanks to his impaling legs, which use his strength once again and have 2 armor penetration and 1 damage. So even his extra attacks are rather powerful compared to what we normally see with extra attacks of this nature. With just the stat line alone, Illuminor Szeras is actually a rather powerful character for his points, and I could see him being taken for that reason alone. However, he comes with a lot of different special abilities, being a named character. The first of the abilities he has is that he's a Technomancer, so he has access to the Rites of Reanimation and the Deathless Arise stratagem to revive Necron warriors and other core units that can be found within your army list. And in addition to those abilities, he also has the Illuminor ability, which allows him to use Rites of Reanimation a second time in 1 turn. This gives him essentially the benefits of being a double Technomancer, and considering a Technomancer costs 75 points, 2 Technomancers would cost a total of 150 points, which brings them in line with the points cost of Illuminor Szeras himself. Now that's a bit of a simplification, as in reality 2 Technomancers is significantly different than 1 Illuminor, but you can see that there is a bit of an analog in that sense. Now continuing down the special ability line, he has the Mechanical Augmentation ability, which lets you at the end of your movement phase select a core Necron unit and roll a d3 to give them one of the following augmentations for the rest of the battle. However, each unit can only be augmented once within a battle, and the augmentations are as follows: 1 to their strength profile, 1 to their toughness, and 1 to their ballistic skill. One of these 3 is chosen at random, and the unit gains this ability. Now, considering your core units are Warriors, Immortals, Deathmarks, Lichguard, and Tombblades, this is a bit of a tricky one because the 1 to the toughness is good on any of the units. However, giving something like Lichguard 1 extra ballistic skill doesn't really do anything, while giving something like the Warriors 1 additional strength is decent, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be incredibly potent within a game, though it can definitely help them a bit in melee if they do get trapped within melee. That being said, I'd say probably the best targets for this are the Necron Warriors, as number 1, you're augmenting the most targets with it, while also having the best results, because while the 1 strength isn't particularly crucial to the Necron Warriors, it's a lot better to give them 1 strength than to give the Lichguard 1 ballistic skill, considering that the Lichguard don't actually have a shooting weapon when armed with a sword and shield. So the 1 extra ballistic skill would be completely useless on them, meaning that you have about a 33% chance of getting one of the abilities that does nothing on the Lichguard, who are already a potent force in themselves. Meanwhile, on the Warriors, you have a 33% chance of getting an ability that's just very mediocre and will only play a role given the circumstance that the Warriors get in combat, which could definitely happen within a game. So an ability that's potentially useless is much better than one that's completely useless. and he can use this ability a second time within a single battle round. If he destroys a model within the fight phase, he can use this ability once again at the end of the phase. Though if you look at it, most of the time you're probably going to be rather light on targets, and this once again kind of reaffirms why the Lich Guard are probably your last target and not your first target, because if you find Illuminor Szeras in combat, he's probably being escorted by a Lich Guard versus Necron warriors, and that means if you augment the warriors first, you can move him away and then continue into combat, as he's a rather potent melee threat himself, along with the Lich Guard, who are incredibly good at melee, and the two of them combined will easily take down most threats within melee combat, and he can augment the Lich Guard if he destroys any model. So all in all, I would say the warriors are your priority target, the Lich Guard are kind of lower on the list, and most of the other choices are kind of a toss-up if you happen to use them. Though if you do happen to start the game off next to some Death Marks, or Immortals or Tomb Blades or something of that nature, it might make sense to augment them, as that's pretty much going to be the only chance you get to do so. So take into consideration how your movement is going to play out, and when you're going to have a chance to augment certain units, or when you're going to have to accept that you can leave a unit unaugmented for a period of time before you actually care about augmenting them, as you're reaching a point of the game where that unit's coming into play more and more. And then the Illuminor has one last ability called the Empiric Overcharge Aura, which states that enemy psychers within 12 inches suffer perils of the warp when they roll any doubles instead of a double 1 or a double 6. That's a rather interesting ability and can be pretty useful against some psychers. However, in many cases I'd rather have something like the Gloom Prison, which allows you to actually deny psychic powers and comes into play every single time a psyker uses a power within range of the unit. Where this might actually destroy a psyker, it doesn't always come into play, and it does require your opponent to roll doubles, where if your opponent's a little bit lucky in their rolls, they can potentially avoid this ability ever coming into play, and it's never good when you're kind of depending on luck for an ability to do something. However, considering the point cost of Illuminor Szeras, he's incredibly good even with this ability not ever coming into play, and it's more of a bonus than anything else, considering how many stats you can bring to the rest of your army. I will say one last thing about Illuminor Szeras is that if you take him as your warlord, he is required to have the Enduring Will trait, which is one of the better traits the Necrons have access to, so it definitely makes him much better in that regard as well, if he happens to be your warlord of your army. All in all, I'll say that it's kind of surprising Illuminor Szeras hasn't seen more play, considering how awesome of a model he is and considering how powerful he can be for his points cost. I do think if they reduce his point cost very slightly, he'll see an incredible amount of play, and when I say very slightly, I would say about 10 points, bring him down to 150 points, at which point he would actually be an incredibly powerful threat and be comparable to the Catacomb Command Barge, which is probably what edges him out currently, as the Catacomb Command Barge is a bit more of an individual threat, whereas Illuminor Szeras requires him to augment some units in order to close that gap between him and the Command Barge. Though considering his ability to put out damage in both melee and range, as well as augmenting other units and potentially dealing some damage to psychers, he is an incredibly powerful force to be reckoned with. And as I mentioned, he's an incredibly cool model, so if you think he looks cool, there's definitely a lot of reason to play him, as he can definitely do a lot of work, though keep in mind that he is a little bit expensive at 160 points. However, his abilities and powers do make up for that point cost, and it's a rather reasonable point cost at the end of the day. Following Illuminor Szeras, the second character to see play, and the only other character to see play within tournaments at a high level, is Orikan the Diviner. And at first I was a little bit surprised to see Orikan see play above all of the other characters, though the more I thought about it, the more it kinda made sense. To begin with, Orikan costs 110 points, and he is a Chronomancer, meaning that he's only 30 points more than your typical Chronomancer. However, he is a dynastic agent and does not have the Advisor ability, meaning he cannot be taken as a free HQ choice. In addition to that, he is rather slow moving compared to normal Chronomancers at a 5-inch movement speed, and he does not actually have an entropic lance, but rather has a Staff of Tomorrow, which uses his strength at only 4 strength baseline, 3 armor penetration, and D3 damage. However, it does ignore invulnerable saves, which is a nice little perk. That being said, he does always fight first thanks to his prescient strikes, and he's no slouch in survivability, coming in at 5 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save thanks to his Time Splinter Mantle, and he only has 2 attacks baseline with a toughness of 4, which does make him a little bit fragile, as well as a 3+ weapon skill, which isn't the best in the world. However, it's not bad either, as he's hitting on 3s, meaning that he's very likely to hit. However, to make up for his underwhelming stat line, he does have this ability called The Stars Are Right, where you roll a d6 in your command phase, and if the result of that roll is lower than the battle round, he becomes empowered, going up to 2+ weapon skill, strength 7, toughness 7, and 4 attacks, making him a rather reasonable threat in melee, though even with 4 attacks at strength 7, he's not the most impressive character, but he'll definitely do some some damage considering that he always fights first and has the 3 armor penetration as well as a d3 damage profile at this point, making him able to take out certain characters rather well considering he also ignores invulnerable saves. And in a strange way, this plays rather well with his 5-inch movement speed, as he's more likely to be empowered by the time he gets into melee combat considering how slowly he's going to be moving across the table, though sometimes he might just get lucky and he becomes empowered right away, making him an incredibly hard unit to destroy thanks to his increased toughness at that point as well as his 4+ invulnerable save. Though in any case, I don't think that's quite the reason why he was seen play, because there are still more impressive options than him in terms of melee for the points cost, and considering a basic Chronomancer is 30 points less and has a better output at his base profile, there is a question of why he saw play, and I think the answer to that question is that he has a Master Chronomancer ability, which is the same as a normal Chronomancer ability, which gives a 5+ invulnerable save and allows units to reroll charges. However, his Master Chronomancer ability can target any Necron unit and not just Dynasty units like the normal Technomancer ability does. This means that he can actually target dynastic agents such as Treyarch Praetorians, who can definitely benefit from both halves of the ability, giving them an invulnerable save which they otherwise lack, as well as the ability to roll charges, allowing them to get into melee and do some serious damage within close combat. And this is actually rather powerful if you're taking Treyarch Praetorians and want to give them a little bit more resilience as well as the ability to engage into melee quicker. However, this is where it becomes a little awkward, as Orikan is rather slow moving at 5 inches, though the Praetorians are much faster moving than he is. That being said, you can still probably find ways of making it work, considering there's a lot of tricks you can pull with a character like Orikan in the Necron forces. And I think in a way, if you're building your army list in such a way that you're taking advantage of his Master Chronomancer ability, instead of just using him as a regular Chronomancer, it can definitely be worth the 30 extra points considering how expensive something like Praetorians are. All in all, I definitely think there's room for Orikan in the tournament scene, and I think there's a lot of utility hidden within that Master Chronomancer ability, although I do definitely think he could use a little bit of a point reduction, bringing him down to 100 points, making him a much more competitive option in comparison to the Chronomancer itself. And otherwise, he's just kind of a decent unit, being able to do some work in melee once he becomes empowered, although even in empowered, he's still not going to be the biggest threat in the world. I definitely think he has a lot more potential than people are giving him credit for, and I think we'll probably see him again in the future, though once again, the extra 30 points does kind of add up rather quickly within the Necron army, which is kind of expensive to begin with. And the question really is, how important is it to be able to target any unit with that Master Chronomancer ability, versus being able just to target Dynasty units with the normal Chronomancer ability? As Necron warriors tend to be a perfectly fine target for your Chronomancers without really having to worry about targeting your Praetorians, especially if you're not running any, at which point the Chronomancer just becomes a lot more cost effective. In third place, I'd put Anrakyr the Traveller, and while I put Anrakyr in third place, I definitely think that 4th, 5th, and 3rd place are all kind of interchangeable in terms of power level, though I just kind of like the aura abilities of Anrakyr more than the others, so that's how I decided to make that choice. And to begin with, Anrakyr is a 140 point overlord that counts as a dynastic agent, which makes him rather flexible. Beginning to look at Anrakyr, he has a 6-inch movement speed, which is rather reasonable, though it's nothing special, and he does have a toughness profile of 5 with a 3+ base save and a 4+ invulnerable save thanks to his phase shifter, which makes him rather standard. Where he becomes a little interesting is that he's armed with a Tachyon arrow as well as a war scythe. The war scythe brings up his strength to a total of 8, making him a rather heavy hitting unit, and it has 4 armor penetration as well as 2 damage, though he only has 4 attacks, which is a little bit of a bummer. However, I would say that profile is better than Orikan because he reaches the 8 strength breakpoint, whereas Orikan empowered is only at a strength of 7, which is just shy of that very important 8 strength breaking point. Now, Anrakyr brings quite a few different aura abilities to the table. Being an overlord, he comes with My Will Be Done, which allows you to target a Necron core unit within 9 inches and give them +1 to hit, as well as Relentless March aura, which adds 1 inch to the movement speed of a friendly core unit within 6 inches of Anrakyr. Following that, he has Lord of the Piranha Legions, which is another aura, and friendly core units within 6 inches add 1 to their attack. Now, the restriction of the core units is rather important here, as it really does limit your options, but giving 1 attack to a squad of Necron warriors is never bad. However, if he's being escorted by a squad of Lich Guard, he does give them the ability to move faster, allows them to hit better, and adds 1 to their attack, making them all the more potent. Though in most cases Lich Guard are rather potent as it already is, meaning that it can be overkill in a lot of situations. So it comes down to how important it is to make those Lich Guard even more potent, and in some cases it could be very important, while in other cases probably just better to save the points and do something else with your HQ choices, though it's definitely an interesting combination of abilities. And while it comes down to specifically if you want to spend the extra 40 points against a normal Overlord in order to give +1 attack to a core unit such as Lich Guard or Necron Warriors, you do get one other ability with Anrakyr the Traveller, which is Mine in the Machine. And Mine in the Machine says that in your shooting phase, you can take control of an enemy vehicle within 12 inches and shoot one of the weapons using Anrakyr's ballistic skill if you beat the leadership of that vehicle on 3d6 or 2d6 if it's Titanic. This can be a bit of an awkward ability to use because you do have to be within 12 inches. However, Anrakyr's ballistic skill is 2+, as well as his weapon skill, so that does make it rather easy to hit, and certain ranged weapons can be incredibly powerful, making this ability a rather heavy hitting ability when it does go off against certain armies, though against other armies that don't depend on vehicles, this can be rather useless, though in most cases this will just be an extra perk that this character has, and it can sometimes do some damage, while in reality the points cost is mostly composed by the stat line as well as a 1 extra attack ability that can be rather potent. I would have definitely liked to see him being able to buff non-core units, though they can get rather silly rather quickly, and Lich Guard are still perfectly fine for his buffing abilities. In any case, I think Anrakyr is probably a little underrated at this time, and if we see a more elite style of play, I can definitely see Lich Guard with Anrakyr becoming a thing in order to destroy some of those elite units much more quickly thanks to that extra attack and the extra little bit of mobility that Anrakyr can give the Lich Guard. Coming in 4th place is Trazyn the Infinite, and Trazyn the Infinite costs 100 points, which is the same as an Overlord, and he is an Overlord, so he does have a very reasonable point cost considering that he doesn't cost anything more than what he would cost if he wasn't a named character, and he might actually be better than Anrakyr as he's also a dynastic agent, and he can be rather powerful for what you gain for his points cost. To begin with, he has similar stats to Anrakyr, although he's a little bit lower on the strength side, with a 6-inch movement speed, a 2+ weapon and ballistic skill, and only a strength of 5, as well as a toughness of 5 and 6 wounds, with 4 attacks and a 3+ base save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, just like most Overlords. However, what he has for a weapon is a bit special compared to other Overlords, which is the Empathic Obliterator, which gives him +2 strength, 1 armor penetration, and d3 damage. Now, once again, this is just shy of that 8 strength breakpoint, so that definitely gives Anrakyr a bit of a leg up on Trazyn in terms of how easily they are able to wound, and Anrakyr has a much better armor penetration profile, as well as a more smooth damage output over time. Now that being said, if Trazyn happens to destroy an enemy character with an Empathic Obliterator, units within 6 inches of the bearer of the Empathic Obliterator suffer d3 mortal wounds, making him able to put out quite a bit of damage against units in the area if he happens to destroy a character. Now what I really don't like about Trazyn is he's locked into the Enduring Will Warlord trait if he's your Warlord or if he takes a Warlord trait, which is rather strange as it would have made a lot more sense to give him honorable combat in order to help him fight characters with that Empathic Obliterator in order to dish out those mortal wounds to surrounding units within range of Trazyn. Though I can see why they gave him Enduring Will, as maybe it was a balance thing, and unfortunately it kinda does limit him. Now being an Overlord, he does have the basic Overlord abilities like My Will Be Done and Relentless March, which we've seen on Anrakyr, so in that sense they're tied, and it does keep him within reason of a normal Overlord. Though the question is the Empathic Obliterator better than the Staff of Light? And I would say I'd probably prefer the Staff of Light. Though something Trazyn brings to the table that a normal Overlord doesn't is that he has the Ancient Collector ability, which makes the first use of dynastic heirlooms to take an extra relic cost 1 less, making it free. And as Necrons have rather good relics, this is actually a rather good ability because all of a sudden you can get that extra relic without paying any command points, and that can be a rather big deal as command points are a premium within the 40k system, especially in 9th edition, where you definitely want to use them on different stratagems, strategic reserves, and other things in order to make your army function smoothly. And as I mentioned, you generally want to have 2 different relics within your Necron army, as Necrons have plenty of good relic choices, so you'll always find some use for his Ancient Collector ability when forming your army list. Now one last ability that Trazyn does have is called Surrogate Host, and what Surrogate Host does is that when he's destroyed, you can roll a d6, and on a roll of 2+, you can swap him out with another infantry character instead of removing him from the table, and he comes back with 3 wounds. This is a bit expensive considering you have to target a character, and most Necron characters are rather expensive on points themselves, meaning that the amount of times you'll use this ability is going to be very limited, and oftentimes you'll probably just let Trazyn be destroyed instead of swapping him out, because all the cheap characters are really good buff characters, whereas other infantry characters are probably more expensive and have more output than Trazyn, although in some cases you might have a regular Necron Lord that you can swap out rather easily for Trazyn. Maybe there's some build around potential for this, but I'd rather not use this ability if I don't have to, so it's really hard to build around an ability that you don't want to use unless it's an absolute last resort. So in reality you're only going to use this ability if there's a Necron character that's about to be destroyed anyway or has outlived its usefulness, and you just want to keep Trazyn around for that Empathic Obliterator. But in conclusion, I think Trazyn is a character that will probably see play at some point, because as mentioned, he's essentially an overlord that costs the same as an overlord, but you do give up the Staff of Light to gain an extra command point when taking a relic. So if there's a situation where you want that extra command point, it's definitely not a bad choice to have, as the Empathic Obliterator can still be rather good, so you're not giving up that much in reality to gain what he brings to the table. And I'm honestly surprised more people haven't played around with Trazyn simply for that extra command point. Then again, maybe it's just easier to take an overlord and go with that, but time will definitely show us how good Trazyn is, and I think Trazyn will definitely show up within armies in the future. Though there could be just a situation where the overlord doesn't see as much play, and as such Trazyn kind of sits on the sidelines, while things like the Cryptics take over instead. In 5th place is Imotekh the Stormlord, and he's another overlord that costs 145 points, so he has access to all of the basic overlord abilities such as Relentless March and My Will Be Done. However, he does have the Pharaon ability, which lets him use My Will Be Done twice. Now the reason I rated Imotekh so low in comparison to Trazyn and Anrakyr is Imotekh is required to be within the Zahndrakh dynasty, as he actually has a dynasty instead of being a dynastic agent like Anrakyr and Trazyn, all of which are dynastic agents and can be fielded within any army, making them a lot more flexible. I still think Imotekh can be rather good, it's just that he's a little more restrictive than the previously mentioned choices. Now to begin with, he has a rather standard stat profile, similar to that of Trazyn, but he has a 2+ normal save instead of a 3+ normal save, and he comes armed with a few different weapons, the first one being a Gauntlet of Fire, which has a 12-inch flamer profile, meaning that it has assault d6 shots, a strength of 6, an armor penetration of 1, and a damage of 1, while also auto-hitting any of its targets. The one big thing I'll say is a strength of 6 is actually rather powerful for a flamer. Normally they're around strength 4 or 5, so it's definitely a nice little perk in that sense. Following the Gauntlet of Fire, he does have the Staff of the Destroyer, which is stronger than a Staff of Light and probably stronger than a Voltaic Staff, which is a great way to get a second Voltaic Staff within an army if you want more of the Voltaic Staffs. And considering the Voltaic Staff is a rather good relic that is often seen within army lists, it's definitely good to have a second one of those on a character such as Imotekh. Now what is the stat profile of the Staff of the Destroyer? Well, it has Assault 3 shots at a range of 18 and a strength of 6 with 3 armor penetration and 2 damage. In melee, it's no slouch either, giving +1 strength, 3 armor penetration, and a damage characteristic of 2. Now that +1 strength does bring him up to a strength profile of 6, meaning that he's hitting the lower end breakpoint of 6 so that he can have an easier time against toughness 3 units, while having a bit of an easier time against toughness 5 units, which are much more common. All in all, that's a rather decent weapons loadout for a character like Imotekh. Now, that's not all Imotekh brings to the table. In fact, he brings quite a few different abilities in addition to his basic overlord abilities. The first is the Grand Strategist ability, which gives you 2 command points if he's your warlord when starting the game. Now, on one hand, this is actually rather nice, as it essentially doubles that of Trazyn. However, there's a bit of an issue with this. As he's required to be your warlord, you are required to take the warlord trait of Hyperlogical Strategist on him, and that's a bit of a tax in itself. Unfortunately, there's no real way around it, and there are definitely better warlord traits within the Necron forces. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely an added cost to Imotekh. Just another thing that makes me rate him lower than other choices on this list. And finally has one other ability called Lord of the Storm, which says that once per battle during the shooting phase, you can select a visible enemy model within 48 inches and roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 6 inches of that model, and you deal d3 mortal wounds on a 4+ to any of those units which you rolled a 4+ for. Then you roll a d6 for the selected model and deal 3 mortal wounds on a roll of 4+ for that model. This can be rather heavy hitting in certain situations, though it does require your opponent to be clustered up, as otherwise you're just dealing a few mortal wounds and it's a one-time use ability, meaning that sometimes it'll do a lot of work and other times it'll just be okay. Though all in all, any ability that generates mortal wounds, especially at that kind of range, is never bad, and considering you're already getting some extra command points and a pretty decent weapons loadout, you aren't really paying that much for it, so it's definitely rather good. What I think is the biggest issue of Imotekh is kind of the restrictions of him having to be the warlord in order to benefit from the extra command points, as well as having a weaker warlord trait and being locked within the Zahndrakh dynasty, as well as being a rather expensive points value. In addition to all of that, makes me feel a bit underwhelmed by him, although I can definitely see him showing up in a list, especially if you like playing Zahndrakh, as he's a perfectly fine choice and can definitely be good within games. Though I do have to ask, is he better than a Catacomb Command Barge? I'd say he's probably not, and it's just probably better to take the Catacomb Command Barge. In 6th place is Nemesor Zahndrakh, coming in at 135 points and being another Zahndrakh overlord, meaning that he has My Will Be Done and Relentless March, as all overlords do. For his stat profile, he comes with a rather standard profile and comes armed with a Staff of Light, which is a rather standard overlord weapon that we've seen many times before. Now that we know the basic abilities that he comes with, let's look at the special abilities that he comes with outside of being a regular overlord. The first ability is Counter Tactics, and what Counter Tactics says is when an opponent goes to use a stratagem, once once per battle you can negate that stratagem, and they do not lose any command points for using that stratagem. This can be a rather powerful ability if you shut down the right stratagem from your opponent at a critical point of the game. Although being a one-time use ability, it does make it a little hard to use, and sometimes you might be able to negate it for one battle round, only for them to use it in the next round and have the same effect occur anyway, so you've only slightly delayed the inevitable. Although in other cases you're going to delay something that will allow you to gain the upper hand and potentially wipe out a unit before it's able to accomplish what it needs to, and that's definitely a very powerful ability to have. I definitely think counter tactics is incredibly powerful, and I think it's something that can be incredibly good in the right circumstances. Then following the counter tactics, he has Transient Madness, which states in your command phase you can pick a Sawtech core unit within 9 inches and roll 3d6. If you happen to roll less than leadership, you get to pick one of the 3 choices, otherwise you generate it randomly on a d3 table like you do with Illuminor Szeras. Now, what do these abilities do? The first is Avenge the Fallen, which adds 1 to the attack profile. The second is Quell the Rebellion, which adds 1 to their ballistic skill. And the last ability is called Solar Mill's Charge, which lets you reroll charges made for that unit. Now, once again, there's a little bit of a problem with these abilities, being that 2 of the abilities are rather good on something like the Lich Guard, while 1 of the abilities is completely dead on the Lich Guard. And unlike the Luminar, the issue is that the other 2 abilities aren't particularly good on Necron warriors, whereas with the Luminar, 2 of the abilities are really good on Necron warriors, and 1 is very mediocre. In this case, 1 of the abilities is rather good on Necron warriors, and 2 are rather mediocre, while 2 of the abilities are really good on Lich Guard, and 1 of them is a dead ability. Though unlike the Luminar, this is a temporary buff, and you can select a unit for this ability every single turn without having to change the unit every time and being stuck with what you rolled and generated, meaning that on average, you'll definitely get more of the good abilities on the Lich Guard than the dead ability, and while it'll be unpleasant when you get the 1 dead ability, at least you can reroll it the next turn, and it can be a rather good ability. All in all, maybe the Nemesor should be higher up on the list, as he's not that expensive and he comes with some rather powerful abilities, being able to buff your units as well as having an incredibly powerful ability in the counter tactic. Granted, he is a very swingy unit, and once again he's kind of competing with the Catacomb Command Barge as well as the Luminar in this case. In most situations, you really have to ask yourself, is the counter tactics worth that 35 extra points in comparison to a normal Overlord, as well as the bit of extra stats you gain on his stat profile? I think it's pretty close to being worth it, although once again, you're locked into Sawtech, which is a little awkward. Last on our list, in 7th place, is Vargard Obyron, and at 100 points, he is a regular lord, not an overlord, and he is locked within Sawtech. The Vargard comes with a 6-inch movement speed, a 2+ weapon skill, a strength of toughness of 5, 6 wounds, 4 attacks, and a 2+ normal save. However, he does not have any invulnerable save, which does make him more fragile than overlord options, and remember, a regular lord is about 70 points, so he is 30 points more. What does he come with in order to make up for these points? Well, he comes with a war scythe, which does bring his strength up to 7, and once again, that's not the biggest breakpoint, but it's definitely not bad to have. And he does have the Cleaving Counterblow ability, which says once he's destroyed, he attacks one last time at the end of the fight phase, meaning that he gets an extra 4 attacks after being destroyed. It's not a bad ability, but you kind of hope it never goes off, unless it's kind of the end of the battle and you just want those extra 4 attacks in hopes of destroying an enemy on its last breath and gaining some kind of victory points off of that. That being said, he has all of the Lord abilities, as he is a basic Lord, which is Relentless March, and the Lord's Will, which is different than My Will Be Done. Nothing particularly special, but hey, it's a little bit of an extra perk. And what Vargard Obyron wants to do is he wants to be near Nemesor Zahndrakh for the reasons that he gains a few special abilities when in range of the Nemesor. The first of these abilities is if he's within 3 inches of the Nemesor becomes untargetable to shooting attacks, and while that's not a bad ability and keeps the Nemesor alive, the lack of an invulnerable save on the Vargard does make it a bit of an awkward ability. It would be easier to surround them with other units in order to make them harder to destroy. The other thing the Vargard has is an interesting amount of mobility, as he can deep strike thanks to his dimensional translocation ability, and he has the Ghost Walk Mantle, which lets him be removed from the table and placed within 3 inches of the Nemesor if the Nemesor is in play. And finally, in addition to all this, if the Nemesor is in your army, Vargard Obyron does not take up an HQ slot, which is nice as the HQ slot is rather crowded. All in all, I don't think he's particularly good, and it's kind of sad to see that all 3 characters that are locked in dynasties are all from Sawtech. It would have been nice to see some characters that were from other dynasties to give those dynasties a little bit of flavor, such as a Novak character that was a Scorpic Destroyer Lord or something of that nature. Maybe we'll see that in the future, but all things considered, the Necrons have so many HQ choices that in reality they probably don't need anything in addition to what they already have within their HQ choices to be perfectly happy with which is rather surprising as most armies have a decent amount of HQ choices, but still have a limited scope in terms of what their HQs do, and you sometimes find it hard to find the right HQ mix within your choices. On the Necrons, on the other hand, you have so many choices that it's rather hard to fit everything you want into an army, meaning that you're usually spoiled for choice in that sense, and you run out of slots before you run out of choices like you do with some other armies. In any case, one thing the Necrons do lack is a low-cost HQ choice, as their lowest costing one is 70 points, whereas other armies might have something like a 35 or 45 point HQ choice that they can bring to the table and open up some of their army list for other options. Though that being said, the Necron choices are so good for their HQs that most of the time you're probably not taking that 70 point HQ choice and rather taking something like the expensive Catacomb Command Barge or the Cryptex as it is, as their abilities are incredibly powerful. That being said, we've finally covered all the HQ choices for the Necrons. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this video or any of the other videos on my channel, please do share the content, as it can help other players out in terms of buying and building an army. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, you guys are awesome people. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.